Living without self. In this talk, we're going to look at two of the teachings of the Buddha, two doctrinal formulations that were actually used for or as objects of meditation. And when it comes to the Buddhist doctrines, we have to remember that the Buddha told us that we should test these as a goldsmith, test gold by burning and rubbing. So doctrines are not necessarily something that we just believe ad hoc. What we do is that we accept that they are pointers to truth. The Buddha gave us the parable of the raft, and in that he using it as an allegory, he said that his teachings were like a raft, therefore crossing over the river of life from samsara to nirvana, and that they are a vehicle, not necessarily something that are absolutely true in themselves. And we've talked about the two truths as well. His teachings were relative truths, that is, that they lead to the truth that cannot be put into words. And of course, the truth that cannot be put into words, certainly as far as the Buddha's teachings are concerned, the most important one is the teaching of anatta, which we came across in the three signs of being. Anatta means no self or no I, and this is known as the lion's roar. The teaching of the Buddha is the teaching of no self. That a teaching which in the Mahayana becomes the teaching of radical emptiness or shunyata. So how do we gain insight into the teaching of no I? How do we actually arrive at that realization? Well, first of all, we have to understand that the Buddha did not teach that somehow anatta was something that happens at some point in the future. What he taught was that there is no self, not that there will be no self. And so this idea that somehow I must get rid of I, or I must somehow be dissolved or whatever, this isn't quite accurate. What the Buddha said was that there never has been a self, there isn't a self now, and there never can be. And so it sort of begs the question, really, because obviously we go through life with this sense of myself in here, and I act as an agent. I am the doing, I am the doer, the one who looks, the one who hears, the one who thinks, the one who has an ambition or has a target, the one who lives his life. And the Buddha said, actually, that's all just an appearance. It's not really how things are. So the Buddha had to then describe how it is possible for all the things to happen in life and in the world that do happen in life and the world without an I. And so the various teachings that he formulated do precisely that. And the teaching of the five skandhas, which is the first one that we're going to have a look at, covers the human being, because the five skandhas describes the elements that the Buddha used to describe the composite human being, what it is to be a human being. And these five skandhas divide up into really two types. The first skandha relates to the body. It's called rupa. Rupa is a Sanskrit term that simply means form, and rather like in the term Buddha Rupa, which means a Buddha statue, but it relates or pertains particularly to and exclusively to the physical form. So it's relates to materiality, to the forms of materiality, the shapes and the substance. That includes the smell, the sound, the tactile, the taste, as well. Those five physical doorways to the physical world. It's through these five physical doorways that we know about the physical world, obviously. And we are also aware of our own bodies. So it means all that. It means not only our own physical organism, it means the five physical senses, sense gates, as they're called, and also the objects of the sense, in other words, the whole physical realm as well. So all of that is rupa, all of that can be known, all of that is materiality, material consciousness, if we like. The next four are psychological or mental. So these are the two types. These are the two types of consciousness of which we are aware: physicality and mentality. And the four mental skandhas relate to Vedana, or sensation, sometimes called feeling. This appears as pleasant and unpleasant, sensations of pleasant and unpleasant and neutral. Then there is perception. Perception, the ability to recognize, the function of recognizing forms, the function of recognizing things and being able to identify them and name them. The fourth one is known as the samskaras. These are known at the rather complicated title of the volitional mental activities. Basically, these are thoughts, conceptions, how we conceive of things. It's the mental maps we use, but it also takes into account as well emotional states, our emotionality, the reactions and judgments I bring to things. Also the notion of I as well arises in the samskaras, in the mental volitional activities. And the fifth one is called vijnana, which simply means mental consciousness, or sense consciousness. And this sense consciousness, remember, this is Buddhism. There are 6 senses, the 5 physical ones and the mental sense, the organ of mental cognition, that perceives the Vedana, the perceptions, and also the mental volitional activities, the thoughts and emotional states as well. So the sense consciousness is the medium by which the 4 previous skandhas can be known. And the practice of using the 5 skandhas was simply that in meditation, in deep, profound meditation, everything that arose would undergo an analysis into those 5 skandhas. So in meditation, a sound would be heard as a sound, a mental object would be seen as a mental object, memory would be seen as a memory. If it was a pleasant memory, then not only the memory would be made distinct in consciousness, but its pleasantness as well would also be seen as well. And these were all the things that were made conscious, or it would be possible to make conscious. And in pursuing these, the clarity, or realizing this clarity of objects that are arising and passing away, continuously arising and passing away in consciousness, the question that's asked, of course, is there any self? Is there anything of I in them? Is there anything that is separate or permanent about them? Anything that's self-sustaining? And as we look, we can see that in fact there aren't, because pleasant sensations arise when an object comes in that's judged as being pleasant, and the same with unpleasant. And if we perceive a friend, for example, once that friend disappears, walks around a corner, we no longer see that friend. And if we have a memory of that friend and the encounter with that friend, then we know that that's a memory as well. And once that passes away, then there's nothing left of it. And so it is with all of these objects, whether they're physical or whether they're mental. They are all insubstantial. They're all subject to change. And therefore there's nothing permanent about them. There's nothing we could call self-sustaining or self-creating or self-continuing, because all of them are dependent on other circumstances, other causes and conditions to come into existence. And just to give an example of that from my own experience, how circumstances themselves can generate real effects in consciousness. I remember many years ago when I had to give a talk, and it was one of the first public talks I'd ever given, and it was on Buddhism, and I was feeling a little bit nervous about it. And of course, when you're nervous, you get a bit, your heart rate increases and you perspire a little bit more and your breath becomes a little bit more rapid. And I was all sort of ready for it, and I suddenly realised that because I was responsible for making sure that the room where the talk was being given was ready as well, that I'd forgotten something, and so I had to dash to the kitchen to get some water. So I ran to the kitchen, and I ran all the way back, and sort of arrived panting with about seconds to spare before we were about to go on. And there I was, having physically run. My heart was increased, my was perspiring, I was flushed, and of course these are all exactly the same physical symptoms as someone who's feeling frightened as well. And so suddenly then I had to walk on stage, as it were, and the fear hit me like a steam train. Full pelt, and I couldn't stop shaking. I was shaking, physically shaking, and I was surprised at the violence of the reaction, the strength of the reaction. It wasn't till afterwards that I realised what had happened, that my body hadn't been able to calm down from the physical exertion, and so when the emotional exertion also appeared, then it simply took over, and it merely exacerbated the experience, and I really felt terrible, really very frightened, a lot more frightened than otherwise I would have been standing up and giving a public talk at that particular time. So the important thing is to see that emotionality was a compound of various circumstances that came together, and if those circumstances hadn't come together, then that emotional state would not have come about. And so this is how the scanders show, through how the analysis of the scanders show, that the states that come about, the physical states, and this includes the mental activity, the thoughts as well, they come about because of circumstances, not because of I. And so the thoughts themselves are subject to causes and conditions, and the emotional states are subject to causes and conditions. And we might be familiar with that as well, because we might know, for example, that, I might be, for example, perhaps I don't believe in ghosts. I think it's all a load of old superstitious nonsense. I know perfectly well there's nothing supernatural at all whatsoever. And nothing to be frightened of if you're walking through a graveyard at midnight. But just perhaps I've been to visit a friend, and we sat and watched a couple of horror films, and it's late and it's Halloween, and I've decided to take a shortcut through the cemetery on my way home, because it's quite a windy night and the clouds are blowing across the sky, and it happens to be a full moon, and it's cold, end of October obviously, and I push open the creaking gate of the cemetery, and I walk through the path, and the wind is blowing at me, and is that footsteps I hear? Is there someone else here? And I begin to look around rather suspiciously. Maybe there is somebody or something here. And I hear something nearby scuttling in the undergrowth, and it just makes me jump like that. And a couple more of things like that, and if I'm really spooked, then I suddenly turn tail and run like heck in order to get home. And of course, once I get home, goodness me, what was I doing? What was I really frightened about? Nothing at all. Honestly, I'm just being silly. But in that moment, could I honestly say that I didn't believe there was anything or nothing uncanny happening? Of course, once it's all over, then I can turn around and say, oh, how foolish. But in that moment, and yet that moment was created by all sorts of seeding, all sorts of causes and conditions, the cemetery, Halloween, the blowing wind, the full moon, the dark, something suddenly, a noise suddenly unexpected, heightened senses, some adrenaline, all those things go together to create that moment of possibility of belief. But once it's all over, then another circumstance takes over. And so we begin to see that when we look at that wheel of life and those 6 realms which we will be coming to, in time, we begin to see that in fact these are just the things that go together to create those states. And so what we have are not just 5 categories of skandhas, 5 categories of physical and mental states, but a continuous coming to be and ceasing to be, a continuous arising and passing away, of almost like a film, a picture. And this is why the skandhas themselves are known as aggregates. If you think about those, I don't know if they still have them now, the painting by numbers, where you used to be given you used to be able to buy them when you were kids, like a canvas, and it would have the outline of the picture, and then each area would have a number on it, and that you would be given some paints with the numbers on, and all you had to do was to fill in the areas with the requisite paint, and you had a picture which you could hang on your wall, and it was a simple way of drawing a picture or painting a picture, quite effective. And this sort of putting things together in this way, almost like a jigsaw, but it's a jigsaw that doesn't last for a long time. It just lasts moment by moment by moment, and then it falls apart again, and to be replaced by another picture, slightly different. And this picture has absolutely nothing to do with I. In fact, the feeling of I, it's almost as if I am in the picture. I am part of that picture, but I'm self-conscious. There's a consciousness that reflects and knows that it's part in there as well, and sees itself, and so and unfortunately makes the mistake of thinking that it is separate and apart from the picture, but in fact it isn't. The one who believed that there's no such things as ghosts, and then in that moment I run because I'm frightened of ghosts, and then afterwards I berate myself for being so silly because there are no such things as ghosts. These are all different selves that arise and pass away, but those selves are part of the picture. They come up to be because of circumstances, because of the past, because of memories, because of dispositions, and so on, a whole range of causes and conditions that come together. And so the practice of working with the skandhas was to be able to break down those circumstances and see that in fact there was no agent in them at all. There was just this flow of what are called the aggregates. And that's what the word skandha actually means. It means a heap or an aggregate, a collection of things that comes together. These are the instantaneous moments that come together, all the circumstances in this moment that have come together to produce this moment, like those elements in that painting by numbers picture, just for this moment, before the next picture appears, already filled in and already complete. And already able to be viewed, and so on. But that movement is so quick that it gives the apparition of being the things in themselves, rather than seeing that all the objects, everything that appears in that picture comes about through causes and conditions, nothing through its own agency. We fall for it. And this series of pictures coming to be and ceasing to be and flowing in this way has a name in Buddhism. It's called the Dharma Santana. And the Dharmas, this is now Dharmas with a lowercase d. We know Dharma with a capital D usually refers to the Buddha's teachings or the inherent law of the universe. But when it's written with a small d, it actually refers to an element or moment of consciousness. If we go back using our analogy of the painting by numbers, we can see that all those individual areas that had to be coloured in different colours within the borders, within the shape, within the border of each form, one for the man, one for the horse, one for the mountain, and so forth. Each of those areas could be referred to as the elements. They just arise for a moment, appear, and then they disappear. And those elements are known as the dharmas. And these elements have only a momentary existence. And perhaps to use another analogy, but a similar visual analogy, if we imagine, for example, that we go to the cinema and we go and see a film, and it's a film about somebody's life from cradle to grave, and the lights go down, and we're there with our popcorn and our soft drink, and the film really captivates us. But what we're actually seeing is a dance of light and shadow on a two-dimensional screen that's coming from the projector. And what's happening, of course, is that the film is made up of all those little instant pictures, those little pictures like those painting by number pictures. And what happens is that the picture slides into place behind the lens, the shutter opens, the light shines through and projects that picture momentarily onto the two-dimensional screen. Then the shutter closes, the ratchets move the film on to the next frame, the shutter opens, the light shines through, projects that picture onto the screen, and the shutter closes, and so it moves on. But that movement is so quick that instead of seeing shadows on a two-dimensional screen, what we see is a three-dimensional world. We see people, we see buildings, we see time passing, we see people growing older, we see the events in people's lives, the highs and the lows, the joys and the disappointments, falling in love, the loss, the achievement, the fame, the fall from grace, whatever it may be. And we could go from one side of the world through to the other and back again throughout a whole lifetime. And finally, we have the death scene and the person passes away. And then the lights go down and we suddenly come back to ourselves and we realise, because we were so engrossed with that film, we had completely forgotten that we were sitting in a cinema with our popcorn and our soft drink, and that we were ourselves. We weren't ourselves when we were watching that film. We'd forgotten that we were ourselves, and we had become the characters on the screen, and we were moved with them, so that when they were high, we were high. When they were cast down, we were cast down, and so on. We had actually become them. This is why we go to the cinema and why we watch things on TV like that, because we're able to become totally immersed if we really like it, if it really moves us. We can become totally immersed into it, and this is something that's great for us because we call it escapism, don't we? It's like being able to escape from myself, able to escape from my own life into this wonderful other world, which may be terrifying, but it gives us a thrill, particularly if it's put together well. It doesn't really matter, and we can live all our fantasies like this, either in space or in fantasy or through time, in a different time period, something like that. And we thoroughly enjoy escaping from what we call our mundane lives. And then when the lights go up, we suddenly realise that, in fact, we hadn't been anywhere at all. We hadn't been back to the Elizabethan era or to the Victorian era, that we hadn't been this person or travelled to Timbuktu. Not at all. We'd been sat in the same place that we'd always been sat in. And this place that we're sat in, of course, is Vijnana. The place that we're sat in is simply the arising and passing away of consciousness. But the elements move so quickly that we do not recognise that the true reality is this very consciousness itself. So we need to be careful, please, because these are not absolute truths. They are suggestive. They seek to shift the ground a little, to undermine the very strong conviction of me and you, I and other, this sharp duality that we have. First, by showing that that there is a relationship and a connection, an underlying connection between all the objects that arise in consciousness, and that nothing is apart. And secondly, to begin to show how factors that have nothing to do with an agent come into play to bring those circumstances about. And so we may begin to think, well, this sort of undermines any belief in free will, doesn't it? If there's no agent, there can't be free will. Well, it also goes to say if there's no agent, then there can't be any determination either. There can't be any fate, because if there's nobody to act freely, there can be no one who can be enslaved or become the victim of fate either, because there's simply no separation between all those things. But actually, there is something that we can do. Whilst we cannot affect what arises right now, for example, if someone bumps into me and stamps on my toe, and that pain goes right through, I cannot just will it away. When the Buddha talked about the end of suffering, he didn't just say, oh, well, I can just will that away. And you'll be able to do that if you practice meditation enough. That's not what he taught at all. But what we recognize is that actually our states of consciousness, whether we are in a realm of unhappiness or feeling oppressed by our thoughts and our mental states, these things are brought about through various causes and conditions. And if we understand what those causes and conditions are, and if we understand, most importantly, the process by which things arise and pass away, then we can do something about it. Because in the same way, if we ask ourselves, why is it that we feel the way we do right now? Why is it that this thought that is arising right now arises? Why isn't it another thought or another mood or another state? The Buddha said this is because the causes of the present state were laid down in the past. The seeds were planted way down in the past. And he said it's actually through our activities, it's actually through our actions of body, speech and mind that we lay these seeds down into consciousness, and that it's consciousness that forms our experience, or that certainly filters our experience. And I mean, there's plenty of evidence to show that this is the case, not only from the books on psychology, which are very clear about that, but also from our own day-to-day experience too. If we really bother to look closely enough, we can see this, how affected we are by our circumstances, what we read, what we talk about, and that our actions really can reinforce mental states. And once we understand that process and recognize the elements that go together to produce the different states, then it becomes a matter of discipline and practice to cultivate those states that lead to wisdom and away from delusion towards the humanity and warmth of heart, and away from the passions of I wanting and I not wanting, and so forth. Once we know that, then it begins to make sense why we have ethical codes, why there are skillful and unskillful actions, why we practice skillful means, why the practices of meditation and awareness and generosity, dana, and so forth, and all those virtuous actions, if they are actually implanting or laying down seeds in this flow of consciousness, in this Dharma Santana, that will ripen in due course. And that process and that path and the states that we have to navigate through, we will look at in the next couple of talks when we begin to look at the Buddhist wheel of life, which lays down very clearly, in fact, all the different elements that go together to make that path, but gives us what we need to know in order to put together our own practice, and that helps us recognize also when we're straying from the Buddha's path. But for now, we'll leave it there. Zenji Sen Zen Rai Zenji Ko Sen So An Zenji Ko Gaku So En Zenji Tetsu So Katsu Zenji Suigen So Zeka Zenji Se So Ho Zenji Dai Yu Myo Kyo Zenji